Imagine waking up one morning to an unexpected knock on your door. It's not a friendly neighbor or a delivery. It's the HOA, armed with threats and demands. They've decided that your cabin, your sanctuary, needs to be sold. But what they don't know is that you're not just another homeowner. You hold a secret that could turn their world upside down. You're not just fighting for your property. You're about to reveal that you control their home. The battle isn't over. It's only just beginning. How far will the HOA go to push you out? And what happens when they realize they've crossed the wrong person? Stay tuned. A warm breeze swayed the trees around the small cabin nestled in the outskirts of town. For Jake and Maria, it wasn't just a home. It was a retreat, a place to escape the chaos of the city and find peace in the quiet of nature. They'd worked hard for it. Late nights, long drives, sacrifices made for this slice of serenity. The cabin sat on a small plot of land surrounded by tall pines, with a winding dirt road that led straight to the heart of their quiet neighborhood, a place where most people knew each other by name and kept to their own business. It was a small community, the kind where neighbors greeted each other with a smile, a cup of coffee, or a friendly wave. The HOA. Well, they'd always been a mild presence. Just a few rules here and there to keep the place looking neat. Nothing extreme, nothing to worry about. That is, until one day when everything changed. Jake had always been the type to enjoy peace and solitude. He wasn't the confrontational type, and he certainly wasn't interested in stirring up trouble. Maria, his wife, shared that sentiment. They'd settled here for the very reason that it was simple, quiet and away from the noise of the world. They spent weekends on their porch, sipping iced tea and watching the sun dip behind the trees. It was a life they dreamed of, calm, steady, and free from drama. But there were whispers, subtle at first. A neighbor or two might mention something about the HOA's latest concerns. It was just rumors, Jake thought. Rules about lawn height, paint color, and those annoying noise complaints every so often. But nothing that had ever made him feel worried. That was until the first official letter arrived. It was a thick envelope, its crisp edges giving the first sign that something was off. Jake held it in his hand, turning it over slowly, as if he could somehow tell what it was just by the weight of it. The HOA wasn't the kind to just send casual notices. When he opened it, his heart sank. A fine. Not for a broken fence or a stray weed, but for something far more personal. They were demanding he sell his cabin. Why? It wasn't like they had ever complained about the cabin's appearance or his property. He couldn't fathom what had set them off. Was it the fact that his neighbors had started to get louder, more insistent about how the rules should be enforced? The quiet complaints about his cabin's rustic look. Jake couldn't tell, but he could feel it building. Something was about to hit the fan, and he had no idea just how deep the web of rules, power, and petty politics in this neighborhood ran. The letter didn't come with a warning or an explanation, only a firm demand to rectify the situation, or else. The or else was vague. But Jake wasn't about to take chances. He showed the letter to Maria, who was just as baffled as he was. They decided to reach out to the HOA, asking for clarification. But when Jake made the call, something felt wrong. The HOA representative sounded too smooth, too rehearsed, as if they'd already been waiting for this moment. Something was up, but what? It wasn't just a letter. It was the beginning of something far bigger. The community they'd settled into, with its peaceful charm and friendly neighbors, was about to be turned upside down. Jake could already feel the growing tension in the air. The HOA wasn't playing by the same rules anymore, and if they thought he'd back down quietly, they had another thing coming. Jake had no idea what kind of storm he was about to step into when he picked up the phone to call the HOA. He'd expected some straightforward explanation, a little back and forth, maybe even an apology for what seemed like an overstep. What he didn't expect was the cold, detached tone of the HOA representative who answered. "Yes, Mr. Richards," the voice said, dripping with an unsettling professionalism. "We've received your inquiry regarding the cabin. It's quite simple. The board has decided that your property no longer aligns with our community standards. We are requesting you sell immediately." Jake felt his stomach churn. "What standards? What are you talking about? We've been here for 5 years and nothing's changed." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a faint click of a keyboard. "I'll send you an email outlining the details," the voice replied. "In the meantime, please make arrangements to comply. The board's decision is final." Jake slammed the phone down. He stared at the small cabin that had been his pride for so many years. He couldn't understand it. There was no damage to the property, no violations, nothing that warranted such an extreme action. Yet here he was facing an ultimatum. When the email arrived, it was even worse than he could have imagined. The HOA had detailed a laundry list of infractions, ranging from a minor patch of untrimmed grass near the back fence to the paint color on the shutters. According to their report, the rustic, faded look of the cabin detracted from the aesthetic harmony of the community. There was a reference to a neighbor's complaint, though Jake had never seen or heard from that neighbor before, and a vague allusion to increased noise levels from his property. Jake's first instinct was to laugh. This was ridiculous. They were grasping at straws. But as he read the last line, the reality sank in. Sell or face legal action. He showed Maria the letter. She was just as baffled, staring at the paper as if it would reveal some hidden truth. "We've never done anything wrong," she said softly. "Why would they do this?" At first, they tried to ignore it. Maybe the HOA had overstepped their bounds. Maybe this was just a rogue complaint from a neighbor with too much time on their hands. But then came the second letter, and then the third, each one more insistent than the last, each one with more fines, more petty rules, more demands. The community they'd thought was so welcoming, so friendly, had turned on them in a heartbeat. The next few weeks were a blur of phone calls, emails, and increasingly strained interactions with the HOA. They began showing up at the house, unannounced, making notes about the unapproved aesthetic. One morning, Jake woke up to find a warning letter taped to his front door about the incorrect positioning of a garden gnome. A garden gnome. That was it. Jake knew the HOA had power, but this was beyond absurd. This wasn't about the rules anymore. This was personal, and they had no intention of backing down. It wasn't just the HOA either. Neighbors who had once waved casually as they passed by started whispering behind closed doors. Jake began to notice that more and more people in the neighborhood were either ignoring him completely or giving him cold stares. His once peaceful walks with Maria had turned into tense encounters, as neighbors who had always been friendly now avoided eye contact or acted like they were walking on eggshells around him. But what really stung was when a friendly neighbor, Mr. Collins, pulled Jake aside one afternoon. "Listen," he said, looking around nervously, "you're not the only one they're after. The HOA, they've been targeting people who they think don't fit the image of the neighborhood. It's not just about the rules. It's about control. They want you out of here. Just thought you should know." Jake's heart sank. He had heard rumors about the HOA's increasing control over the neighborhood, but to hear it from someone who had lived there as long as he had made it real. He couldn't just sit back and let this happen. He had to fight back, and so he did. He started gathering evidence. He began documenting every interaction with the HOA, every letter, every phone call, every visit. He even started recording conversations when they showed up unannounced, trying to catch them in their game of petty rule enforcement. But it wasn't easy. The more he dug, the more he uncovered how far the HOA would go to maintain their grip on the neighborhood. They had power, real power, and they weren't afraid to use it. Then came the fines. They started small at first, $50 for an untrimmed bush, $100 for the gnome, $200 for improperly placed firewood. But soon they grew larger, $1,000 for an old fence that wasn't even visible from the road, $500 for excessive noise, even though Jake had done nothing out of the ordinary. The final straw came when they slapped him with a $3,000 fine for what they called a lack of proper landscaping. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, Jake had had enough. He wasn't about to let them run him off his land. But the more he thought about it, the more it hit him. He wasn't just fighting a bunch of petty bureaucrats. He was fighting a machine. An HOA that didn't care about rules or fairness, only control, and they had the whole neighborhood backing them. But what Jake didn't know yet, what neither he nor Maria could have imagined, was that the HOA wasn't just after his property. They had bigger plans, and that's when the phone call came. It was late in the afternoon, the sun beginning to dip behind the trees. Jake was in the garage, sifting through old paperwork, when the phone rang. "Mr. Richards?" The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, cold. "We've reviewed your case, and after a final vote from the board, we're proceeding with more formal action. You'll be receiving a court summons soon." Jake's heart dropped. This wasn't just a petty dispute anymore. This was real. The HOA had gone to the extreme. He couldn't back down. But what Jake didn't know, what he had no idea was coming, was that the final confrontation would be far more intense than a court battle. The HOA wasn't the only force he had to worry about anymore. There were darker forces at play behind the scenes, forces that had been quietly watching, waiting, and when they finally made their move, everything would change. But that wasn't the only twist. No, this story wasn't just about rules, fines, or shady HOA politics. It was about revenge, about power, manipulation, and a plan that had been in motion for far longer than Jake could have imagined. Stay tuned, because the real battle is only just beginning. The morning of the court hearing arrived with a suffocating weight on Jake's shoulders. The crisp air outside only reminded him of the cabin he could lose, a life he had fought so hard for, now at the mercy of an HOA, with an iron grip on the neighborhood. Maria had tried to reassure him all week, but the worry in her eyes told a different story. They were about to go head-to-head with a system that had grown too powerful, too unyielding. They arrived at the courthouse, their hands trembling as they walked through the heavy doors. The large marble floors felt cold under Jake's boots, the space echoing with the footsteps of those who had already surrendered to the bureaucracy. As they checked in, Jake couldn't help but notice the faces in the crowd. A few lawyers, some tired-looking homeowners, but then, there they were, the HOA, a small but forceful group of board members, their stone faces glaring from across the room. Jake had already heard whispers about the HOA's strategy, how they were trying to pull every string to ensure they won. The lawyer they'd hired was a big name in real estate disputes, known for his cutthroat tactics. But Jake had something they didn't expect: information. For weeks he'd been digging into the HOA's operations, pulling public records, getting the dirt on their shady dealings, and finding ways to turn the tables. Every violation they had found with his cabin was petty, unsubstantiated, and most importantly, they had no real legal basis for it. Jake knew that, and he was about to make sure the court knew it too. When the hearing began, the judge seemed like the picture of patience, but Jake could tell the HOA was going to pull out all the stops. The moment the lawyer for the HOA stood up, he launched into his opening statements with rehearsed venom. "Your Honor, we are here because Mr. Richards has shown blatant disregard for the community's rules," the lawyer said, his tone dripping with superiority. "This is not just about a few minor infractions. This is about a man who believes he is above the law and whose actions are harming the aesthetic harmony of our neighborhood. Jake clenched his fists, holding himself back. This wasn't about the neighborhood. It wasn't even about the rules. This was personal, and he knew it. But when it was Jake's turn to speak, he stood tall. He had all the evidence now. Documents, emails, even testimony from neighbors who had turned against the HOA's bullying tactics. He wasn't going to back down. Not this time. Your Honor, Jake started, his voice steady. This isn't about property standards. This is about control. This is about an HOA that has been making arbitrary, unfounded demands for years, targeting anyone they think is vulnerable. They've come after me, after my family, and now they want to take my home. He paused for a moment to let his words sink in. He knew the HOA was used to playing the victim, but today the narrative was shifting. I've documented every demand they've made, every fine, every illegal rule they've tried to enforce. And the truth is, their own actions are the real violation. They've been harassing homeowners, punishing them for trivialities, and pushing them out if they don't comply. Jake pointed to the stack of documents in front of him, the pile of evidence that he'd gathered meticulously over the past few months. He'd collected everything, emails from the HOA's board members, records of how they'd ignored their own bylaws, and even a history of how they'd used their power to force neighbors into submission. Then he dropped the bombshell. "And here's the kicker, Your Honor," he said, his voice growing in confidence. "The HOA has been operating illegally, not just with me, but with everyone in this neighborhood. They've been using our fees and fines to fund private projects under the table. They've been misappropriating funds, inflating costs, and making promises to the residents that they've never intended to keep." A stunned silence filled the room. The HOA lawyer's face drained of color as Jake pulled up the public records, the ones the HOA had thought were hidden away, detailing the financial irregularities. Jake wasn't just fighting for his cabin anymore. He was fighting for every homeowner who had ever felt the sting of the HOA's manipulation. And that's when the tide began to turn. The HOA's lawyer sputtered, his carefully crafted arguments unraveling with each piece of evidence Jake presented. He tried to counter, but his words faltered as the truth sank in. Then came the final blow, Jake's trump card. "Your Honor," Jake said, "I've saved the best for last. The HOA's demand for me to sell my cabin. It wasn't just a whim. They've been trying to force me out for years. They've targeted me because they know I own something that can't be ignored." He turned to face the judge, his eyes steady. "I don't just live in this neighborhood. I own the land on which the HOA's offices sit. I am, in fact, the bank that holds their mortgage." The room went dead silent. The HOA lawyer looked like he'd just seen a ghost. The faces of the board members, once so self-assured, now mirrored confusion, then panic. They had underestimated Jake. They had never imagined he would hold the one card that could change everything. Jake continued, his voice unwavering. "So if you want me out of here, you're going to have to take this fight all the way to the top, because I control your property now, and I'll use every bit of leverage. I have to make sure you don't get another inch of ground." For a moment, the court was still. The judge's eyes moved between Jake and the HOA, processing the bombshell that had just been dropped. The HOA board members exchanged nervous glances, and their lawyer was now fumbling through his papers, his strategy completely shattered. The judge cleared his throat and leaned forward. "I will need to review all of this," he said slowly. "But what Mr. Richards has presented today is compelling." Jake could feel the weight of the moment. For the first time since this nightmare began, he felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't just fighting back. He was winning. The HOA's abuse of power had finally caught up with them. But just as Jake thought he might be able to take a breath, the HOA lawyer stood up again, his face pale. "Your Honor," he said quickly, "we request a brief recess to—" "No," the judge interrupted, his voice sharp. "No more delays. I've seen enough." The room held its breath. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as the judge paused, clearly weighing the decision before him. He could feel the shift in the air. The moment where everything could change, where the tides of power had flipped. And then the judge spoke. "Mr. Richards, your evidence has raised serious questions about the HOA's conduct and its legal standing. I'm inclined to rule in your favor." Jake's chest tightened. But before he could even process what that meant, the judge raised his hand, signaling that there was still more to be said. "But," the judge continued, his eyes narrowing, "before I make any final rulings, I'm going to require a full investigation into the HOA's financial practices. I want everything, and I want it now." The final blow was delivered. The judge had just turned the tide in Jake's favor. But the HOA wasn't done yet. This fight was far from over. The days following the court hearing felt like a blur. The world had shifted in a way Jake couldn't quite wrap his head around. He had gone from fighting a losing battle to standing at the edge of something much bigger than just the future of his cabin. The truth was out now, and there was no turning back. It took a few weeks for the judge's ruling to come through, but when it did, the impact was undeniable. The HOA, once a force that seemed untouchable, was suddenly on the defensive. The judge had ordered a full investigation into the HOA's financial practices and how they had been misusing their power for personal gain. The fallout was swift and brutal. The board members, who had once held their heads high, were now scrambling to cover their tracks. As the investigation into the HOA's practices unfolded, more secrets came to light. Jake's discovery had been just the beginning. It turned out that the HOA had been using their position to funnel money into private accounts, inflating fees and embezzling funds from homeowners' dues. The small fines they imposed were actually a way to force neighbors into submission, and the bigger projects they promised were always underfunded, leaving their own pockets fat with money that should have gone to the neighborhood. The community, which had once been divided, now came together. Neighbors who had avoided Jake for months suddenly came forward, offering their support. They had been too afraid to speak up before, but with the investigation revealing the full extent of the HOA's abuse, they found the courage to join him. Some homeowners even filed their own complaints, backed by the evidence Jake had uncovered. People who had been silent for years were now raising their voices, demanding accountability from the HOA. The media, which had largely ignored the dispute when it was just about a man fighting a fine, now took a different interest. Reports began to surface about the HOA's corruption, and soon the story reached local news outlets. The small town that had once seemed so peaceful was now the epicenter of a larger fight against corrupt power. What had started as a personal battle for Jake had turned into a public spectacle, one that raised questions about the unchecked authority of homeowners associations across the country. As for Jake and Maria, the weight that had been hanging over them for months began to lift. The judge ruled in their favor, effectively halting the HOA's efforts to force them out. They were free to stay in their home, but what had started as a fight for their property had grown into something far more meaningful, a fight for justice. The HOA was forced to disband. Their legal standing was shattered, and while they fought back with their own set of appeals, they couldn't undo the damage that had been done. The investigation, backed by the evidence Jake had so painstakingly gathered, was too powerful to ignore. They had no choice but to settle, paying back the stolen funds to the homeowners they had exploited over the years. The board members who had been at the forefront of the HOA's control faced criminal charges, with some even being forced to pay restitution. The legal system had finally done what it was meant to do: hold those in power accountable. It wasn't just a victory for Jake and Maria, it was a victory for the entire community. The people who had once been silenced by fear and intimidation now had the courage to speak out, to stand up against the kind of unchecked authority that had ruled their lives for too long. In the months that followed, Jake and Maria found peace again. But it was a different kind of peace. Their cabin, once just a quiet retreat from the chaos of the world, had become a symbol of resistance, of the fight for what was right. They had stood up to a system that had tried to break them, and in the end, they had come out victorious. But there were long-term consequences that rippled throughout the community. For the first time, homeowners' associations began to face scrutiny, not just in Jake's neighborhood, but nationwide. Activists and local politicians took up the cause, demanding that HOAs be more transparent and held to a higher standard of accountability. Laws were proposed to limit the power of these organizations, to prevent future abuses, and to ensure that homeowners had a stronger voice in how their communities were run. Jake, once just a quiet homeowner, found himself being asked to speak at town hall meetings, to share his story of how one man's determination had brought down an oppressive system. He never asked for the attention, but it was clear that his case had sparked a movement. He and Maria began to get letters of gratitude from neighbors they'd never spoken to before, people who had watched the battle from the sidelines, afraid to act, but now inspired to take control of their own lives. The most powerful part of all of this was seeing the HOA's grip finally loosen. It wasn't just about defeating one organization. It was about taking back the power of the individual, the right of the homeowner to have a voice, and the reminder that no one, no matter how powerful they seemed, was above the law. One day, as Jake and Maria sat on their porch, watching the sunset, Maria turned to him with a smile. "Do you think they ever thought someone would fight back?" she asked, her voice soft. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "I don't think they ever imagined someone like me would come along," he said. "But I guess that's the thing. When you're fighting for something that matters, something that's yours, you find the strength you didn't know you had." Maria leaned back, looking at the horizon. "I don't think we'll ever be the same after this." Jake nodded. "No, but that's okay. We're stronger now, and we've got each other." The truth was, this fight had changed them. It had made them realize the importance of standing up for what's right, no matter how daunting the odds. The experience had not only given them their home back, but had also restored a sense of power to a community that had been living in fear. It wasn't just about the cabin anymore. It was about reclaiming a piece of the world that had been stolen from them, and showing everyone who was watching that the power of one person could, indeed, change the course of everything. As Jake and Maria sat on that porch, the sun dipping behind the trees, they knew their fight was over, but the lesson would live on, echoing through the neighborhood for years to come. No one was untouchable, and sometimes the hardest battles lead to the most unexpected victories. And so the neighborhood began to heal. It wasn't perfect, but it was free. The voice of the community was stronger now, more united than it had ever been before. And every time Jake looked out at his cabin, he saw not just the home he had fought for, but a reminder that no one should ever underestimate the power of a person who has nothing left to lose, but everything to fight for. The final message was clear. When the system fails you, and when the rules are rigged, it's time to take a stand. And sometimes, that stand leads to the kind of change no one ever expected.